Greg's hand shook as he gripped the controls of his ship. The small vessel groaned under the strain of escaping the clutches of the pirate ship that had been chasing them for hours. Sweat dripped down his face, and his heart raced. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had never imagined it would end like this. Beside him, Mira was sitting tense, her fingers gripping the armrests of her seat. She was trying to stay calm, but Greg could see the fear in her eyes. They had been through a lot together, moved from colony to colony, dodged criminals, and survived on the edge of the law. But this was different. The pirates weren't after them for money or for the cargo they were carrying. No, they were after something else. Greg's ship shuddered violently, jolting him out of his thoughts. A warning light blinked on the control panel. He quickly scanned the readout. The engines were failing. The pirate ship had hit them with an energy weapon. They were drifting, helpless in the cold emptiness of space. Greg. Mira's voice was sharp, full of panic. What do we do? I'm trying, Greg muttered, his mind racing. He wasn't a pilot, not really. He had only learned enough to keep them out of trouble. But now it felt like everything was crashing down at once. His hand shook as he tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. The pirate ship was closing in. They wouldn't have much time before they were boarded. He glanced at Mira again, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. She was looking at him, wide-eyed, knowing there was nothing more they could do. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat dripped down his spine. He could feel the weight of her gaze, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then, the communication console crackled to life. A voice, cold and cruel, came through the speaker. "This is Captain Ratter of the Black Fang. You are out of time." Greg, the pirate captain's voice echoed, sending a chill down his spine. "You have two choices. Surrender and we'll take your ship, or you can offer something of value, and we'll let you go." Greg swallowed hard. Mira's eyes locked onto his, searching for some answer. He felt his throat tighten as his mind raced. He could feel the fear in her gaze, the unspoken plea in her eyes. "We're not going to make it out of here alive, are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Greg's heart clenched. He knew the answer. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. The pirate ship was far stronger than their small transport. He could see the fear in Mira's eyes, and it twisted inside him. He loved her more than anything, but the fear that gripped him made it hard to think straight. There was no way they could survive this. They couldn't fight their way out. The pirate captain's voice came again, this time with a mocking tone. "Well, Greg, I'm waiting." In that moment, something inside Greg snapped. He looked at Mira one more time. Her face was pale, her expression filled with silent terror. He knew the pirates wouldn't kill them outright. They were far worse than that. They would sell them, take them, and turn their lives into something unrecognizable. The cold, hard truth hit him. There was no way out, no way to save both of them. But there was one way to save himself. Greg looked back at the console, his eyes blank. His mouth was dry, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "I'll give you her," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but loud enough to be heard across the comm. "Take her. I'll go free." Mira froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at him, disbelief washing over her features. She shook her head, as if she hadn't heard him right. But Greg knew what he'd said. He couldn't take it back. "You're what?" Mira finally managed to say, her voice barely audible, as if she was in shock. "I'm sorry," Greg said quickly, though the words felt empty. He couldn't meet her eyes. I can't think of another way. They'll kill us both if we don't." But Mira didn't hear him. She turned away, her face pale, her hands trembling. Greg could hear her trying to control her breathing, but the hurt was already clear. The pirate captain's voice interrupted them, cold and uncaring. "Wise decision, Greg. We'll take her off your hands. Come quietly, and we won't harm her." Greg felt a pit form in his stomach. He heard the sound of a ship docking, the airlock hissing as it sealed. A chill ran through him. This was it. The pirates would board their ship and take Mira. She would be theirs. He had saved himself, but at what cost? As the pirate crew began to board their ship, Greg could hear Mira sobbing quietly, her body shaking. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't face the pain in her eyes. The pirate captain's footsteps echoed down the hallway, and a cruel voice said, "Take her to the hold. The deal's done." Greg's chest tightened as he heard Mira's sobs growing fainter, swallowed up by the dark corridors of the ship. He had made his choice. He had saved himself. But in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be able to forgive himself for what he had done. Greg's ship drifted aimlessly through space. The silence was deafening. All he could hear was the quiet hum of the failing engines. Mira was gone. The pirates had taken her, and he had let it happen. He had betrayed her. He gripped the controls, trying to focus on the repairs, but it was no use. The ship wasn't going to make it far without proper help. Not with the damage they had taken from the pirates' attack. And even if it did, what was the point? He wasn't going anywhere. Mira was gone, and it was his fault. Greg let out a long sigh, resting his forehead against the cold, cracked glass of the control panel. His mind raced, replaying the moments over and over. He had chosen to save himself. He had told himself it was the only way to survive. But now, the weight of that decision pressed down on him with every passing second. He could still see her face, pale with shock, as he handed her over to the pirates. She hadn't said a word when they dragged her away, but her eyes, those eyes, they told him everything. The pain, the hurt, the betrayal. He had destroyed everything. "What have I done?" Greg muttered to himself, clenching his fists. His chest tightened as a wave of guilt washed over him. He had always prided himself on being a survivor, on making the tough calls. But this wasn't survival. This was cowardice. The stars outside the window blurred as his mind spun, replaying the moment of weakness. The choice he had made had seemed so simple at the time. They were in danger. The pirates were ruthless. He couldn't let them both die. But at what cost? Now, as he floated alone in the cold emptiness of space, the truth settled in his chest like a stone. He had sacrificed his own humanity for his survival. Greg slammed his fist against the control panel in frustration. He had never felt so small, so weak. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. Every minute he spent drifting was another minute lost. Another minute Mira was somewhere out there, possibly being sold to the highest bidder, forced to live a life of pain and suffering because of him. The thought made him sick to his stomach. But then something inside him stirred. A spark of defiance. A tiny ember of hope. He couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't take back the moment he had betrayed her. But he could do something now. He could go after her. He could try to make things right. He had to. Greg shook his head, his hand steadying as he reached for the controls again. He didn't know what he was doing or how he would even find her, but he couldn't just give up. He couldn't let the pirates win. He couldn't let her slip away forever because of his fear. He had made a terrible mistake, but maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to fix it. He wasn't sure how. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try. As he fired up the ship's engines, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He was going after Mira. He didn't care what it took. He would face the pirates. He would fight them. He would do whatever it took to get her back. His mind raced as he scanned through the ship's computer. He had no way of knowing where the pirate ship had gone, but there were always records. Pirate ships, like any other ship, needed to dock somewhere for supplies. They needed fuel. They needed repairs. There had to be a trace. There had to be a way. Greg pulled up a map of the surrounding system. He could see a nearby black market space station, a place where smugglers, bounty hunters, and pirates often made deals. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. The pirates would have to stop there eventually. His heart pounded as he punched in the coordinates. The ship lurched forward, the engine sputtering to life as they engage. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He had to find Mira. He had to save her. As the ship sped through space, Greg thought back to the woman he had betrayed. Mira had always been the strong one between them. She had been the one who kept them grounded, who kept them going when things got tough. She had always believed in him, even when he had doubted himself. And now he had let her down in the worst possible way. He could still see her eyes, the way they had looked at him in those final moments. It wasn't just hurt he had seen there. It was disappointment. She had trusted him, and he had broken that trust. "I'm sorry, Mira," Greg whispered to the empty cockpit, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll fix this. I swear." The journey felt endless, the weight of guilt and regret never leaving him for a second. But as he got closer to the black market station, he started to feel something else, something stronger than guilt. He felt a growing sense of purpose, of determination. He wasn't going to let the pirates win. He wasn't going to let his mistake define him. The station came into view, a dark, foreboding structure surrounded by dozens of smaller ships, all docked and ready for trade. Greg could see the faint glow of neon lights flickering through the station's windows. It was a den of criminals and thieves, but it was also the place where he could find Mira. He landed the ship in one of the lower docks, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. He couldn't afford to draw attention. The last thing he needed was to be caught by the pirates before he found a way to track down Mira. As he stepped out of the ship and onto the station's cold metal floor, Greg felt a mix of fear and resolve. This was just the beginning. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he didn't care. He was going to make things right. He was going to find Mira, and he was going to bring her home. The black market space station was darker than Greg had imagined. Dim lights flickered above, casting long shadows along the narrow corridors. The air smelled of old machinery, stale food, and the sharp scent of cheap fuel. It wasn't a place anyone would want to linger, but for Greg, it was the only place that mattered. He had to find Mira. He had no idea where to start, but he had to try. He glanced around, feeling out of place among the rough-looking people who filled the station. Smugglers, bounty hunters, and traders moved about, each with their own purpose, ignoring him as if he were just another face in the crowd. But Greg knew he couldn't remain unnoticed for long. The pirates who had taken Mira were dangerous, and he had no doubt that they would have allies here. He needed help. Greg had no idea where to go or who to trust. His thoughts were racing when he heard a voice from behind him. "You look like a man who needs something." Greg turned quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward the weapon at his side. But he stopped when he saw the speaker, a tall, wiry man with a scar running down the left side of his face. His clothes were worn but practical, and his eyes were sharp, assessing Greg like a predator looking for weakness. Greg hesitated. "I need information." The man raised an eyebrow. "Information is expensive, friend, and I don't come cheap." He looked Greg over once more, sizing him up. "But you look like you're desperate. Desperation makes people interesting." Greg felt his stomach tighten. He had no time to waste. He needed to find Mira before the pirates sold her off or worse. He didn't care how much it cost, as long as he got the information he needed. "How much?" Greg asked, forcing the words out. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't take credits," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "But I'll make you a deal. I need a favor, a simple one. Help me out, and I'll give you what you want." Greg frowned. He didn't like the idea of owing anyone favors, especially not in a place like this. But he had no choice. He had to trust someone. And right now, this man seemed like his only option. "What's the favor?" Greg asked, keeping his voice steady. The man's smile widened. "There's a job I need done. Nothing too difficult. Just a delivery to a contact on the far side of the station. You do that, and I'll point you in the right direction. Sound good? Greg considered it for a moment. He had no idea what the job entailed, but it couldn't be worse than continuing to search aimlessly. Plus, this was his only lead. All right, Greg said. I'll do it. The man nodded, handing Greg a small package wrapped in cloth. Take this to Core in Docking Bay 47. Tell him it's from Raoul. Don't open it. Just get it to him. Greg took the package, weighing it in his hands. It wasn't heavy, but it felt solid, and something about the way the man handed it to him made Greg uneasy. Still, he had no choice. Docking Bay 47, Greg repeated. I'll be back with the information. Raoul didn't respond, just turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Greg watched him go before he turned on his heel and made his way toward the docking bays. As he walked, the noise of the station grew louder, echoing off the metal walls. There were more people now, people who didn't seem to care about anything except their own business. Some glanced at Greg with curiosity, others with suspicion. He kept his head down, his thoughts focused on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. When Greg reached Docking Bay 47, he was greeted by an empty hallway. The place seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The dim lights overhead cast long shadows across the metal floor. He had a bad feeling in his gut, but he pushed it aside. He had to stay focused. At the end of the hall was a door marked with a single number, 47. Greg approached it slowly, his hand tightening around the package. He didn't know what to expect on the other side, but he knew he had to complete this task if he wanted any chance of finding Mira. He knocked once, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, a man sat at a desk, surrounded by crates and scattered tools. He looked up as Greg entered, his expression blank, but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail. You Raoul's guy? The man asked, his voice low. Greg nodded, stepping into the room. I've got something for you. From Raoul. The man didn't speak. He just extended a hand, and Greg placed the package in it. The man studied it for a moment before setting it aside. He didn't seem to care much about the contents, but that didn't ease Greg's nerves. Something wasn't right. What's the deal with this? Greg asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying Greg with a calculating look. Raoul doesn't send people unless it's important. What do you need? Greg hesitated, feeling the weight of the man's gaze. I'm looking for a ship. A pirate ship. The Black Fang. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, but his face remained neutral. Pirates. Huh. You're in the wrong place for that kind of business. I need information, Greg said, his voice steady. I need to find the Black Fang. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. A lot of people have asked for the same thing. I'm guessing you're not just another lost soul. What's your stake in this? Greg's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to tell this stranger everything, but he knew he had to make it clear he was serious. I'm willing to pay. I need to find someone. A woman. She was taken by the Black Fang. The man studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You're in over your head, friend. But I'll tell you this. There's a black market auction coming up. The Black Fang will be there. You want to find your woman. That's where you need to be. Greg's heart raced. It wasn't much, but it was something. He could work with this. I'll be there, Greg said, determination in his voice. And if the Black Fang's there, so am I. Greg's mind raced as he made his way back through the station. The information he had received was both a relief and a new worry. The Black Fang pirates were holding an auction. It wasn't a guarantee that Mira would be there, but it was his best lead, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The space station buzzed with activity as he walked, but the excitement and chaos around him barely registered. His only focus was the auction. If he could get to it in time, He might be able to find Mira, if she was still there. He didn't have much time to waste. The auction wasn't a public event. The Black Fang kept it under wraps, held only for the highest bidders and the most dangerous people in the galaxy. Getting in would be tough, but Greg had no choice. He made his way to a back alley on the lower levels of the station, where he had learned the auction would be held. The hallways here were darker, narrower, and filled with shady figures, all of them moving with purpose. Smugglers, bounty hunters, mercenaries, people who lived outside the law. Greg tried not to make eye contact with anyone, staying as invisible as possible. He needed to focus on the task ahead. No distractions. When he reached the entrance to the auction hall, 2 large guards stood in front of a steel door. They were armed and looked tough, tougher than anyone Greg had ever dealt with. It was clear they weren't letting anyone in without a good reason. Greg hesitated. He didn't have a plan to get past them. He didn't have a disguise, no backup, nothing. But he did have one thing: determination. Taking a deep breath, he approached the guards, walking with confidence despite the knots in his stomach. He could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up as he got closer. He kept his expression neutral, his hands relaxed by his sides. The first guard stepped forward, blocking his path. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gruff. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act fast. "I'm here for the auction," he said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "I've got something they'll want." The guard raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think we'll let you in?" Greg smiled, though it felt forced. "I've got a valuable item. Something the Black Fang would pay well for." The guard glanced at his partner, who gave a slight nod. Then the first guard stepped aside, motioning for Greg to follow. "We'll see what you've got," he said, his voice skeptical but not dismissive. Greg held his breath as he walked past the guards and into the auction hall. The room was larger than he expected, filled with dim light and shadows. The walls were lined with tables stacked with goods, illegal weapons, rare artifacts, and supplies that were hard to come by. In the center of the room, a stage was set up, where people gathered to bid on whatever was up for sale. It was chaotic, loud, and full of dangerous-looking individuals. Greg's eyes quickly scanned the crowd, looking for any sign of the Black Fang. They were a notorious pirate group, but they kept their identities hidden. He knew they wouldn't be wearing their usual pirate colors. They would be blending in, just like everyone else. He had to act fast. The longer he stayed here, the more likely it was that someone would recognize him, or worse, that the pirates would sell Mira to someone else. Greg moved toward the back of the room, where a group of well-dressed individuals stood watching the auction. They looked out of place among the rough crowd, but Greg could tell they had money. They were likely the buyers, the ones willing to pay a fortune for whatever was up for sale. He caught sight of a man with a thin mustache and dark glasses, standing in a corner talking to a group of other men. Greg recognized him immediately. The man was Kor, the contact Ral had mentioned. He was known for dealing with pirates and smugglers, a man who could get anything, if you had the right price. Greg approached him cautiously, trying to keep his distance from the main auction area. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. As he got closer to Kor, the man glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Greg. "You got what I asked for?" Kor asked, his voice low. Greg nodded, pulling out the package he had delivered earlier. "Ral sent me. I did the job." Kor took the package without a word, inspecting it briefly before nodding. "Good," he said. "Now, what do you want?" "I need to find someone," Greg said, his voice steady but urgent. "A woman. She was taken by the Black Fang. I need to know if she's here." Kor's eyes shifted around the room, calculating. "The Black Fang?" he asked, as though considering the risk of helping Greg. "That's a dangerous group to get involved with. You sure about this?" Greg clenched his fists. He didn't have time for hesitation. "She's the only thing that matters. Please, I need your help." Kor hesitated for a moment longer, then let out a deep breath. All right, you've got guts. I'll tell you this, but it won't be easy. The Black Fang are auctioning off people today. If she's here, she'll be up for sale. But getting to her won't be simple. Greg felt his heart race. He had to act fast. Where do I find them? Core jerked his head toward the far side of the room, where a group of pirates were standing near the stage. They were dressed in dark, worn clothing, their eyes scanning the crowd for potential buyers. One of them, a tall woman with bright red hair, was clearly in charge. That's Captain Tessa, Core said quietly. She's in charge of the auction. If anyone knows where your woman is, it's her. Greg nodded, his eyes fixed on Tessa. She was the key. If he could get to her, he could find Mira. But getting close to her would be dangerous. He needed a plan. With a deep breath, Greg steeled himself for what came next. He had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. Greg watched Captain Tessa from across the room, his thoughts running a mile a minute. She was standing at the edge of the stage, speaking to a few shady-looking individuals who had just placed their bids on a rare weapon. Her sharp eyes scanned the crowd, watching for anyone who might cause trouble. She had an air of authority, someone who wasn't afraid of making tough decisions. Greg knew getting to her wouldn't be easy. She looked like the kind of person who didn't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who were asking too many questions. But if Mira was here, she was the only one who could help him. Taking a deep breath, Greg made his way across the room, trying to look confident. The auction hall was filled with people, but it was quieter now. Most of the bidding had slowed down, and everyone seemed to be waiting for the next item to be put on sale. Greg used the lull in activity to his advantage. As he got closer to Captain Tessa, he couldn't help but notice the way people stepped out of her path, giving her space. She was clearly well respected, maybe feared. Greg's stomach tightened, but he pushed forward. When he was just a few steps away, Tessa turned her head and locked eyes with him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she raised an eyebrow. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but commanding. Greg felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice steady. Tessa studied him for a moment, her gaze intense. She didn't speak right away. Greg could feel the weight of her scrutiny, and for a moment he wondered if she was going to turn him away. But then she nodded slightly. "Follow me," she said curtly. Without waiting for Greg to respond, she turned and walked toward a small door at the back of the room. Greg had no choice but to follow. He kept his distance, not wanting to seem too eager, but every step felt like a heavy one. The door led to a narrow hallway that was dimly lit, the walls made of cold metal. The air smelled of oil and rust. It felt like a part of the station that was hidden from the world, a place where deals were made away from prying eyes. Once they were far enough from the auction hall, Captain Tessa stopped and turned to face Greg. "You're brave coming here," she said, "but you're also foolish. Do you know what kind of people you're dealing with?" Greg nodded. "I know, but I'm looking for someone. A woman. She was taken by your people." Tessa's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. "A lot of people get taken by the Black Fang. Why should I help you?" Greg took a step closer, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Because I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not leaving without her." Tessa seemed to consider this for a moment. Then she sighed, running a hand through her short, dark hair. "You really don't know what you're asking, do you? The Black Fang doesn't do favors. We take what we want, and we sell what we don't need. You won't get her back unless you're willing to pay the price." Greg felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of price? Tessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to a nearby table and picked up a small data pad. She handed it to Greg, her gaze never leaving his face. "Here," she said, "this is a list of the things we're selling today. If you want to find your woman, you'll need to make a bid." Greg took the data pad, his fingers shaking slightly as he scanned the list. There were weapons, technology, and even slaves. People sold as if they were objects. His stomach twisted as he realized what he was looking at. "I don't have credits," Greg said, his voice tight. "I don't have anything to offer you." Tessa chuckled, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "No credits. Then you'll need to find another way to pay. We don't deal in kindness here. What do you have that's worth something?" Greg's mind raced. He didn't have anything valuable, not in the sense that Tessa was looking for. But he had one thing he was willing to risk: his life. "I'll do anything," he said, his voice steady. "I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you ask." Tessa looked him over, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "Anything, huh? That's a bold promise. I don't take lightly to empty words." "I mean it," Greg said, his voice firm. "I'll work for you until I've earned her freedom." Tessa stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, to Greg's surprise, she nodded. "All right," she said finally. "You've got a deal. But don't mistake this for charity. You're signing up for a dangerous life, one where you'll owe me everything. You'll work for the Black Fang until I say otherwise." Greg nodded without hesitation. "I understand." Tessa handed him the datapad again. "This is the first task," she said. "Deliver this to the buyer in the next room. Don't open it. Just get it there. If you do well, I'll consider it payment toward your debt." Greg took the pad, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He had no idea what was inside, but he knew it didn't matter. This was his chance to get closer to Mira, and he couldn't afford to mess it up. "Get going," Tessa said. "And don't disappoint me. If you do, the deal's off." Greg didn't waste another second. He turned and walked quickly toward the door, his mind already racing with thoughts of the next step. This wasn't how he had imagined rescuing Mira, but it was the only way. If he had to work for the Black Fang to get her back, then so be it. He wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward the next room. The weight of the datapad in his hand felt heavier than before. He didn't know what was inside, but Tessa's words kept echoing in his mind. He had to do well, or this deal, this chance to find Mira, would be over. As he approached the door, he could hear voices from the other side. The room was dimly lit, and the air smelled like burnt metal and smoke. He hesitated for a moment, gathering his courage before pushing the door open. Inside, there were a few people standing around a large table, talking in low voices. At the head of the table sat a tall, well-dressed man with dark hair and cold eyes. He looked up when Greg entered, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Ah, you must be the messenger," the man said with a faint smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Greg's throat went dry. He had expected to deliver the pad and leave quickly, but the man's eyes made him feel like a fly trapped in a web. He forced himself to stay calm. "I've got the delivery," Greg said, holding out the datapad. The man raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He looked over at one of his associates, who quickly took the pad from Greg's hands and handed it to him. Without saying another word, the man began to inspect the datapad, flipping through the information with practiced ease. Greg waited, trying not to look too nervous. He needed this moment to go smoothly. If this man was satisfied with the delivery, Tessa might trust him enough to share more information about Mira. The room was silent except for the soft clicking of buttons on the datapad. Greg's mind raced. What was inside the pad? What was so important? He could only hope it was something that would keep the man interested long enough to fulfill this part of the deal. Finally, the man looked up, his expression unreadable. "This will do," he said simply. Greg breathed a small sigh of relief. But the man wasn't finished. "I assume you didn't come here just to deliver a datapad," the man continued, leaning back in his chair. "You want something, don't you?" Greg's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming. The man wasn't going to let him off that easy. "I'm looking for someone," Greg said, his voice steady. "A woman. She was taken by the Black Fang. I need to find her. The man studied him for a long moment. The room grew still, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. Finally, the man gave a small nod. I thought you might be here for that, he said, almost as if he were amused. What makes you think we can help you? I'm willing to pay, Greg replied quickly. I'll do whatever it takes. The man smiled, but it was a cold, calculated smile. We all have a price, he said, but the Black Fang isn't in the habit of giving away anything for free. You're asking for a favor, but you don't have the resources to back it up. Greg clenched his fists. He was out of options. He had no credits, no bargaining chips, but he couldn't back down now. Mira's safety depended on it. I'll work for you, Greg said, surprising himself with the words. I'll do whatever job you have, anything. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Anything you say? Interesting. You don't seem like the type who would work for free. What's your real motivation? Greg hesitated, but then spoke the truth. I just want her back. That's all. The man studied Greg's face, seemingly weighing his words. All right, I'll make you a deal, he said slowly. You work for me. You do whatever job I give you, and when I say you've earned it, we'll talk about your woman. But I warn you, these jobs will get more dangerous, and you might not walk away from all of them. Greg's heart pounded again, but he nodded. I understand. The man smiled again, his expression turning slightly less hostile. Good. You'll find that loyalty is a rare commodity in this world. You're proving you've got some. That's worth something. He stood up from the table, signaling that the conversation was over. You've got your first job. I'll send someone to give you the details. Don't fail me. Greg stood still for a moment, still trying to process what had just happened. He had made a deal with a dangerous man, but he hadn't been given much choice. If he was going to get Mira back, this was the only path he could take. As he turned to leave the room, one of the man's associates approached him. He handed Greg a small data pad, similar to the one he had just delivered. Here are the details, the associate said. Don't make us wait. Greg nodded, taking the pad and walking out of the room. The hallway was quieter now, the hum of the station's systems the only sound in the background. He opened the pad and quickly skimmed the information. It was a list of coordinates. Each location was marked with a specific mission, a target to be eliminated, a supply shipment to be intercepted. Dangerous work, but it was the only way forward. Greg swallowed hard, trying to suppress the fear rising in his chest. He didn't have much choice. He had to prove himself to these people, or he'd never see Mira again. He took a deep breath and set off toward the nearest location on the list. Each step felt like it brought him deeper into a world he didn't understand, but it was a world he had to navigate if he wanted to save the woman he loved. Greg stood at the edge of the docking bay, his eyes scanning the horizon as the ship he had just boarded slowly powered up. His heart was pounding, his palms slick with sweat. He had completed the first job for the Black Fang, and now he was being sent on another. This time, it was even more dangerous, a mission to recover a stolen piece of technology from a heavily guarded compound. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't afford to fail. His thoughts drifted back to Mira. He had promised her he would save her. Every moment that passed, every job he completed, brought him closer to that promise. But the cost of the deal was starting to weigh heavily on him. He had worked for the Black Fang for weeks now, doing whatever they asked. Dangerous missions, shady jobs, all while keeping his true goal hidden. But the deeper he got involved, the more he saw the ugliness of the world he was now trapped in. The ship's engines roared to life, shaking him out of his thoughts. He glanced up to see the pilot, a woman with dark eyes and a stern face, staring at him. You ready for this? She asked, her voice steady. Greg didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. I'm ready, he said finally, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was ready for anything. The ship lifted off, leaving the docking bay behind as they shot into space. Greg's thoughts wandered again, his mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Was this the right choice? Was he becoming like them? Just another pawn in a game of power and betrayal? No, he couldn't afford to think that way. He had to keep his eyes on the prize. Mira. The journey to the compound took hours, the ship cutting through the quiet emptiness of space. Greg spent the time going over the details of the mission again, trying to prepare himself for what lay ahead. He had been given a set of coordinates, along with instructions to infiltrate the facility and retrieve the stolen device. The job seemed straightforward enough, but he knew that nothing about the Black Fang was simple. As they neared the compound, the pilot's voice broke through the silence. "We're almost there. You know what to do." Greg nodded, gripping the seat as the ship slowed its approach. The compound appeared on the screen ahead, an imposing structure, surrounded by high walls and guarded by armed personnel. It looked like a fortress. "I'll be in and out as quickly as I can," Greg said, his voice low. "I'll get the device, and we'll be gone before they even know I was there." The pilot gave him a short nod. "Good luck. We'll be waiting for you." The ship docked on a small platform just outside the compound, and Greg gathered his gear. He had learned quickly how to handle himself in situations like this. Disguises, stealth, and quick thinking were his tools now. But he knew that no matter how prepared he was, it wasn't going to be easy. He stepped off the ship, his feet hitting the cold metal of the platform. The compound loomed ahead, its walls high and forbidding. He moved quietly, staying in the shadows, avoiding the patrols that circled the perimeter. The plan was simple: find the target, grab the device, and get out. He didn't know who had stolen the tech, but he wasn't here to ask questions. All he cared about was completing the job and getting back to Mira. Greg reached the outer wall, using a small device to disable the security system. It was a small victory, but one that gave him a sense of progress. He climbed over the wall and slipped into the compound without a sound. The building was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Greg crept through the halls, moving like a shadow. He passed several guards, but they didn't notice him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it distract him. His focus was clear. Finally, he reached the room where the stolen device was being held. It was a small, fortified area in the heart of the compound, heavily guarded. Greg knew he couldn't just walk in. He needed a plan. He spent several minutes observing the guards, waiting for the right moment. Finally, he saw an opening. One of the guards stepped out of position, leaving the door unguarded for just a moment. It was his chance. Greg slipped inside, moving quickly but quietly. The device was on a table in the center of the room, surrounded by complex security measures. But Greg had learned how to disable these systems. He carefully approached the table, using a tool to bypass the security and unlock the device. As soon as the device was in his hands, he felt a surge of relief. He had completed the mission. He was one step closer to getting Mira back. But as he turned to leave, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around just in time to see two guards charging at him. Without thinking, Greg darted toward the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. The chase was on. He could hear the guards shouting, their footsteps echoing in the hall behind him. He pushed himself harder, running faster than he ever had before. He wasn't going to let them catch him. He reached the outer wall of the compound and climbed over it just as the guards closed in. He barely made it over the top, feeling the sharp sting of a blaster shot graze his shoulder. But he didn't stop. He jumped down to the other side, landing hard on the ground. His breath came in short gasps as he sprinted back toward the waiting ship. The pilot was already at the controls, the engines roaring to life as she saw him approach. "Did you get it?" she asked, her voice sharp. Greg didn't answer at first. He just held up the device, his body trembling with adrenaline. "Let's go," he said. Without another word, the ship took off, blasting into the sky. As they ascended into space, Greg sat back in his seat, breathing heavily. He had completed the mission, but the journey wasn't over yet. There was still Mira to save, and he wasn't going to stop until he had done everything in his power to bring her home.